On April 26, 1986, a nuclear reactor exploded in northern Ukraine. The blast tore open reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, exposing the reactor core and releasing a massive cloud of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The explosion itself lasted only seconds. The consequences have lasted decades. And more than 30 years later, one question still refuses to settle. How many people actually died because of Chernobyl? Depending on who you ask, the answer ranges from a few dozen to several thousand to tens of thousands. These numbers are not exaggerations. They are the result of how death is defined, how radiation works, and how difficult it is to trace long-term health effects back to a single event. To understand the real toll of Chernobyl, we have to break it down carefully. When the reactor exploded, 2 plant workers were killed almost immediately. In the days and weeks that followed, dozens of firefighters and emergency workers rushed in to contain the fire and stop the reactor from burning deeper into the earth. They had little protective equipment. Many did not even know they were being exposed to lethal radiation. Within weeks, 28 of those men died from acute radiation sickness, a condition caused by receiving an extremely high dose of radiation in a very short time. Together with the initial explosion victims, this brings the official immediate death toll to 31 people. This number is not disputed. It is the figure recognized by the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. But these deaths represent only the most visible part of the disaster. Radiation does not only kill instantly, its most dangerous effects often unfold slowly, over years or even decades. One of the clearest long-term consequences of Chernobyl has been thyroid cancer, especially among children. After the explosion, radioactive iodine spread across parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Children drank milk contaminated with this isotope, which concentrates in the thyroid gland. In the years that followed, thousands of thyroid cancer cases were diagnosed in people who were children at the time of the accident. Most survived due to early detection and treatment. However, a small number of deaths, estimated in the dozens, have been directly attributed to radiation-induced thyroid cancer. These cases are among the few long-term deaths that scientists are confident linking directly to Chernobyl radiation. Beyond thyroid cancer, the picture becomes far more complex. Hundreds of thousands of people were exposed to elevated radiation levels, not just plant workers, but soldiers, engineers, miners, medical staff, and civilians. These people became known as liquidators, individuals sent in to clean up the disaster and limit its spread. Official registries show that around 600,000 people were granted liquidator status, though some estimates suggest the true number may have been higher. Many of them worked under dangerous conditions, often without fully understanding the risks. Over time, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, neurological problems, and cancer were observed among these groups. However, establishing direct causation is extremely difficult. Radiation-related cancers often look identical to naturally occurring cancers. They develop slowly, and they occur within populations that already experience cancer from many other causes. Because of this, scientists rely on statistical models rather than individual death certificates. In 2005, a major international review known as the Chernobyl Forum brought together experts from multiple United Nations agencies. After analyzing decades of data, they reached a conclusion that shocked many people. According to their findings, fewer than 50 deaths had been definitively linked to radiation exposure at that time. However, based on radiation dose modeling, up to 4,000 additional cancer deaths may eventually occur among the most heavily exposed groups, including liquidators, evacuees, and residents of highly contaminated areas. This figure does not mean that 4,000 people died immediately. It is a projection, an estimate of excess cancer deaths that may occur over the lifetimes of those exposed. This number represents the mainstream scientific consensus accepted by organizations like the WHO and IAEA. But not everyone agrees with this estimate. Some researchers argue that the UN projections underestimate the danger of low-dose radiation. Using broader statistical models, they apply small increases in cancer risk across millions of people exposed to fallout throughout Europe. These studies produce much higher estimates, tens of thousands of excess cancer deaths, sometimes more. However, these figures are controversial. Critics argue that when extremely small risk increases are applied to huge populations, the uncertainty becomes enormous. Others point out that many of these models cannot reliably separate radiation effects from lifestyle, environmental, and genetic factors. As a result, these higher estimates are not accepted by most international health agencies, even though they continue to appear in public debate. What complicates matters further is that many people were exposed in ways never officially recorded. The article you provided describes factory workers in Chernobyl, well outside the exclusion zone, who became ill after handling contaminated wool. Radiation levels in that factory were dangerously high. Hundreds of women were later granted liquidator status. Most were not emergency responders. They were ordinary workers, exposed indirectly through contaminated materials that should never have been moved. Stories like this suggest that radiation exposure was more widespread than official maps initially indicated. They also highlight a painful reality. Many health effects may never be fully counted because they occurred far from the reactor and years after the explosion. So where does that leave us? Here is what can be said with confidence. 31 people died directly and immediately due to the explosion and acute radiation sickness. Several dozen more deaths have been clearly linked to radiation-induced thyroid cancer. Up to approximately 4,000 additional deaths are projected by the United Nations among the most heavily exposed populations. Claims of far higher death tolls exist, but remain scientifically disputed and depend heavily on modeling assumptions. In other words, the exact number will likely never be known, but numbers alone do not capture the real impact of Chernobyl. Entire cities were evacuated. Hundreds of thousands of lives were permanently disrupted. Millions lived for years with fear, uncertainty, and declining health. The disaster created not just physical damage, but psychological scars, including elevated rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among those involved in the cleanup. Chernobyl did not end in 1986. Its effects are still unfolding, and the true human cost may never fit neatly into a single number.